Setting versus settling. I was thinking while I was finishing up the podcast yesterday. Setting up the podcast yesterday. The props and the green screens, the scripts that we've written for ourselves. Those props and green screens, that mentality of remakes and no takes, so we ain't gotta. And then when I got the remakes and no takes, I started thinking about setting versus settling. And I was thinking about, are you setting the tone for the new standard for your true self, or are you settling based on trying to get somewhere? And then I was thinking about, if I'm always in the right position, in the position of the right position that I'm in is in the now, and I started thinking about being the original. Now I started thinking about being the creator of my dynamic, of my space. And then I really started thinking about natural. What is natural to my natural self, to my soul? What is natural to our integrated aspects when we integrate with our shadow? And I started thinking, I was like, I'm not going anywhere. Truly, I'm not going anywhere. Because if I am in the now, in this position, and I'm aligning myself to my abundant mindset, I'm aligning myself to my prosperity, my wealth, then the most overwhelming thought, the trigger to overwhelming myself is saying that I'm going somewhere. Would be saying that I'm going somewhere. Instead of me allowing myself to sit in the space and assess myself. Remember last week I talked about assessing our goals. This week we're going to be getting deep into really sitting with yourself, especially with this, the first day of Taurus energy. So this is that moving forward, setting that standard. So it made me even think even more about setting that standard, setting that tone, setting that standard for ourselves. Are you setting are you setting the standard? Are you living in your standards? Or are you settling based on the old standard? A lot of times when we come into ourselves for our growth, it goes into, remember last week I talked about that compartmentalization, and we confuse that with making our boundaries. But if I'm now setting my standard, I'm no longer compartmentalizing my life to keep things balanced so I can have happy distractions. I'm actually focused into myself. That means I'm focused into my rest. I'm focused into my resting when I need to rest. I'm okay with saying no. I'm okay with setting my standards and my tones based on my truth of me opening myself and being vulnerable. A lot of times we stay stuck within the standard. We stay stuck within these old standards of ourselves that we put onto ourselves based on those identities, based on those wounds. So we'll set a standard based on the rejection wound. So my standards can be really low if I'm basing myself on not being rejected or being accepted. My standards can be really set really low if I base my mindset on the lack mindset, or I don't want to offend anybody, or I don't want to say anything, because the first thing that you'll say is, I know my mouth, and once I start saying things, I get really, really cutthroat, and I'm trying to hurt people. The first thing that you would ask yourself in sitting in this space is, why are you so quick to want to cut people or hurt people? Because we've all seen that meme. We've all seen it. Hurt people hurt people. Hurt people will hurt people. Unhealed people will always feel attacked whenever it's time for them to come into their healing. When you're facing the truth of yourself, that openness and that vulnerability that we come into is going to require a different set of standards. Once you start healing yourself and bringing yourself into this now, the position that you're in right now, once you put yourself into this position, it's going to require a new set of standards with yourself. I remember for myself where I would minimize myself, and I've talked about this many times before. I would minimize myself. I would put myself in a position where I minimize myself due to fear of someone rejecting me. I wouldn't say the thing that came. I would not speak clearly or learn the aspects of learning my emotions for the fear of my emotional content. And I remember putting myself into that space, and then I started noticing that I was settling for others' standards. I would be in positions settling for others' standards. Well, if you're going to be here, you got to do this. And it's like, it was always going back to a childhood wound. A lot of these old standards, or a lot of the conduits for our standards that we've set for ourselves, is based off of a childhood wound. How many times have you heard that you went back if you can go back in the day and you heard your mother, your father, your stepfather, your uncle, whoever raised you, and they would say things of, if you're going to be in my house, you're going to live by my rules. There's actually a TikTok video that I'm going to upload a little bit later that I saw. And it's like, these traits we use to set our standard. These traits we use to set our standard based on settling. I'm going to do this. As long as you're in this house, you got to abide by my rules. You have to respect me, even if I don't respect you. These are a lot of the unspoken aspects that we have lived through. And it was based on survival, because a lot of us was raised on survival, that escapism, the survival complex. We weren't really raised in a space where it was really love. So when it came to us coming into a space like now for myself, like just coming into a space with myself for a lot of times, it was that ego based. When it came to me, was like, you have to love me for me, instead of me honoring others for how they displayed their aspects of love and how they were teaching me. I shut myself down from learning a lot of things. I shut myself down from embracing a lot of lessons, from learning a lot of things, from learning how to change and evolve myself, from learning how to invest. There were so many things that I would shut myself off from because I was still stuck in those old standards. So when I set the tone for myself in my now, it would always be against this thought process of, yo, the only thing I'm trying not to do is what I had to go through then. As long as I'm not going through what I had to go through then, I'm okay. As long as I'm not in that space right there, I'm all right. But as I broke down in this week's podcast episode, I still was going based on old scripts. So I would use that as my bottom line. My bottom line to my contract, when I was signing out these new contracts and signing out and giving out these advances, it would always be the same exact contract. Always same exact contract. Well, you got to understand that I've been through some things, and it's hard for me to trust people. It was like, how many times was I going to run this same script before I took accountability for why I wasn't trusting people? How many times would you sit here in a position with yourself, and how many times would you sit here with yourself in a position where you're always going to go to that status quo or this old standard and realize that that's what's setting up your background? That's your background. That's your green screen. Everything around you becomes the prop based on that green screen. So now you got your green screen is your trauma. That wound. That's the big ass green screen. That's your background. And then you sitting in every space, and now the props that are in your space help set that tone. Those props help you set that tone. Well, it's because, I didn't get help when I was younger. So now every time that I got a chance to help people, are you helping or are you enabling? Ask yourself that question. Was I helping or was I enabling? Was I asking for help Or was I asking for someone to enable me to continue doing what I'm doing? Was I settling, or was I setting the tone for a standard? Enabling and being a crutch, it's all based on no accountability. So I was settling. A lot of the times I was settling in a lot of spaces. So the more that I settled, when I came into a space where I was actually being challenged, I didn't know how to accept it. I was used to the filler. A lot of times I was used to filler. You can tell somebody, it's like certain things that I've learned over my studies and just for myself. I remember I used to apologize profusely to people. I used to apologize all the time. I would always try to make it. I would apologize and I would immediately try to augment my acts, my thoughts, my mindset, what I was doing to fit that space so I can continue being inside of that space. So if somebody was being direct with me, I didn't know how to take it. I would automatically feel offended and I would still use the same trigger response, because it was a trigger response, in order to avoid them leaving, to avoid them abandoning, avoid them rejecting me, avoid them saying something to me. I would always try to go fix it quickly, instead of me sitting there in that space and ask the why. Remember, we going throughout the why all this week. I would always go through the aspects of not asking why. I would just be like, so what would you need me to do? When do you need me to do it? I would always do it like it was based on an assignment. I would always stay stuck in this space of doing it based on an assignment. But this is what I noticed. When they didn't say anything, then I wouldn't do it. That was based on a childhood wound. It's similar to like, if your mom comes into your room and she tells you to clean your room, after a while, if your mom don't tell you to clean your room, you ain't gonna clean your room. If your pops come in there and tell you to clean your room, or your pops ain't there, and then there's no one to tell you to do something, you ain't gonna really do it. That's the wounds. That's us living through these wounds based on settling. A lot of us come into this space with ourselves. Remember, I've talked about it before, to where whatever happened to you when you was 10 years old, 11 years old, 12 years old, back in these inner child wounds, whatever happened then, until you deal with this, you've been living out that aspect your entire life. Even if you right now 40, 50, 60, however old, there's 60-year-olds that still think that they're 18, because the most dynamic aspect that happened in their life happened when they were 18, and they've been living out that same aspect over and over and over again. You can tell by the props that they've chosen. The props being their clothes, the props being the vehicle, the props being the way they put their house together. They always have all of these types of props. But this is the thing. My pops told me a long time, he was like, everything that they do on the television, he said it's a long while back, way back, and I never understood it. Now, everything that you see on TV, when the lights go off, they got to take all that shit off. And it made me think about my life. It made me really think about myself in that space. It was like, at the end of the day, when I'm done playing that role, I got to take all that shit off. How much of that shit is really me? How many have I really seen myself naked? Have I really seen myself without anything on? Like without anything. None of the labels, none of the identities, none of the things I used to exist inside of a space. If I didn't have those things, what would I be? Just as simple and plain into that space. Until I acknowledge these things, the things that I'm doing now wouldn't even hold weight, because I have a new standard. As you start addressing what you settled for based on the traumatic responses, that traumatic reaction, you kept getting triggered, so you responded and you reacted based on that trauma. Everything that you build within that space is going to be a projected aspect. It's going to be a projection. A prop. Literally, it's going to be a prop. It's all going to depend on the green screen or that trauma being exposed. That trauma being prevalent. A lot of people come into that space with themselves of, oh my God, the they and the agents and the secret societies and governments. The only reason that you may be getting triggered by secret societies and shadow governments is because there's a family secret that is the equivalent to the secret society. That family secret is the equivalent to the shadow government that's running your life. You got a family secret that's running your life. You got an aspect that's running your life in the background that's been there the entire time. Every time that you get, what are you doing with it? Are you settling? Are you settling? Or are you setting are you setting or are you settling? Are you setting or are you settling? Every time that you set that new standard, because remember, I talked about it Friday, your boundaries are automatic. Your boundaries are automatic. As you start to heal, as you start to elevate, as you start to work on yourself, your boundaries are automatic. If you find yourself trying to set a boundary, you're maybe setting up compartmentalization. I learned that with myself. Like, I remember saying, okay, on this day I would do this, and over here I'm going to do this. I was setting up compartments. I wasn't setting up boundaries. Boundaries come naturally as you start to set your tone, as you start to set your standard. Boundaries come naturally as you start to set your standard. Everything that comes up based on you setting that standard is naturally going to come up against your boundary. It's okay for you to sit back and say you need to rest. It's all right for you to say there, okay, cool, I'm going to spend this time alone. You don't need a reason out. You don't need to go search for a logical reason for you to be to yourself. You don't need to go search for a reason to, if you feel you need to be to yourself, be to yourself. Take that day, take that hour, take that time to yourself. What are you doing with that time? What are you doing with this time, right? What are you doing with this time for yourself? Setting that new standard for yourself. You're the only one. Your dynamic of you, the dynamic of you, the dynamic of me, the dynamic of you, and how you understand yourself into that depth, that's based on you. Nobody else is going to be able to set the standard for you unless you want to be working for them for your entire life. That's how a lot of us treat ourselves in spaces. We get stuck on that trauma, that traumatic experience, that event happened, and then we call ourselves, our friends, I've said it before, our friends are really associates. Our family, they're just simply related based on the secret in the family trauma or the events. That's all that they are. So after we start dealing with it, it's like, what is their role now? What is their role? A lot of people around us, a lot of people around you, and I talked about this in the podcast a little bit, and we'll get deeper into it on Friday. A lot of the people that are around you are actually soulless as fuck. They are pure urge. They're always in the state of needing an urge. They need a filler. They need an impulse point in order for them to navigate through their life. Without that impulse point, they can't move. They don't know how to act. They don't know how to govern themselves. A lot of people around you are soulless or close to it. And the only thing that keeps giving them their activation is every time you walk around. Every time you go over there in that space. We're going to get deeper into that on Friday. We're going to get deeper onto it Wednesday. But I want you to think about it like this. And this is one of the things that I really had to learn and really had to research with myself was like, I was judging people. I started looking at people based on discernment, based on how many times they would tell me, do you remember when? That's one of the key identifiers that's coming through. How many times are they always going to say, do you remember when? You have to start start using discernment and everybody that keeps saying you remember when. It's okay to reminisce. It's okay to reminisce. It's okay to reminisce, understand the lesson, that because that's a part of our healing, but it's a difference between reminiscing and reliving. To where they say, you remember when we used to dress like this, and then 2 days later, they dressed just like that? Or you remember when we used to drink just like this, and then 2 days later, they're drinking just like that? You don't see no break? That's letting you understand that they may be soulless. They lost to the world. Lost to the world. It's one of my favorite things to sing out loud. They lost to the world. One of the most hard-hitting things for myself, and I'm going to get into it throughout the week, one of the most hard-hitting things for myself was realizing that one of the most hard-hitting but most releasing feelings that happened to me was realizing that my karmic family, the karmic aspects of soul contracts, and how much of my soul contract that I closed out. And I'm looking at my space in there, and I was really looking at, I talked about it in the podcast, like I remember at 12 years old when my pops was gone. Like his soul left. My pop's soul has been gone since I was 12. Because I remember like he would just always be angry. He would always be angry, always be in this uproar. He could not express anything else but anger. And I was like, damn, he's not here anymore. And we're going to get into these identifiers on Friday. But there's a lot of times we keep trying to go back in there and try to we kept trying to bring them here, and they're gone. And it's okay. You got to realize, like, I remember the memory. There's people that you can look at right now that you looked at 3 years ago that you look at right now and they still doing the same exact thing. That's because they are not here anymore. They just keep acting out the same impulses. And the only reason that they keep coming up is because, oh shit, you're there. But if you ain't there, what are they doing? There's always something that fills into that spot that keeps them doing what they're doing. I remember when I was close to being not here anymore for myself, and that shit fucked my head up. Because I look back doing my shadow work, and I look back and I was like, there was a moment in time where I was damn near gone. Almost gone. And that shit fucked me up. But that's all a part of the realization. That's all a part of the openness. That's all a part of you becoming vulnerable. That's all a part of you integrating with your shadow. Owning your shit. Owning yourself. Ownership. This LLC mentality is synonymous to everything else that you're going to build on top of it. What is your foundation? What do you want to tap into? What do you want to be? What are you aspiring to be? What's your plan of attack? What's your plan of attack? What's your call to action? What you want to do? Want to be ballers, shot callers, brawlers? What you want to be? What you want to do? You want to, because regardless, I always use this example before we close it out, and I talk about the podcast. Regardless, right now, where you at right now, this is your what, and now you're going into the how. Regardless of the next 4 years of your life, these next 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, 16 years, they gonna go by regardless. Whether you make an impact or not, these next 4 years, we're gonna start with 4 years, are gonna go by regardless. They're gonna go by regardless. What are you going to do with these next 4 years? Hell, what you going to do with the next 4 months? What you going to do with the next 4 days? What you going to do next 4 hours? The next 4 hours? What you going to do right now? What are you going to do to impact the day to where when you wake up tomorrow, that impact ripples into that next day? That's growth. That's your evolution. That's your healing. That's that work. And if you're interested within readings, setting up that consultation, I got a couple this week. Setting up that consultation, setting up for that reading, getting that work done, starting doing this work, getting that therapy, getting into this space so we can actually start breaking down some shit, busting shit wide open. GoticoAlchemistLLC.com, or you can hit me in the inbox or hit me at 910-777-7708. Because all I do is want you to be the best. Everybody got a role to play. It's time to acknowledge that in the podcast, this week's episode of the podcast, we got into acknowledging that we built our script based off the agent, our traumas being our agents. So you got every role that you played off your trauma being your agent. It's time for you to start managing yourself. But in order to manage yourself, you got to learn what the trauma, you got to learn the game that the trauma been running. It's okay though. I want you to be the fucking best. Yeah, I want you to be the best. There's no excuses other than the ones that you set for yourself. Stop settling and start setting. Don't be afraid to set your standard. Don't be afraid to set the tone. Don't be afraid to set up yourself to fucking... There's nothing stopping you. There's nothing stopping you, period. You can use the same old excuses, but it's the white man and the black people and people ain't gonna support me. Okay, cool. That's the price that you paying in order for you to evolve. That's the price you pay for in order to evolve. I made a post the other day. I was like, whether somebody owes me $200, $3,000, $200, $2. That's the price that I paid for peace. Okay, if they're avoiding me, that's the price that I paid for peace. That's the price I paid to learn that lesson. If I hold on to that, they holding on. They own me. They own my masters. They can publish my works at all times. So it's just time to let go. You only gonna have one or two decisions. Either you're gonna stay there or you're gonna leave. What you wanna do? You wanna be ballers, shot callers, brawlers. But I love you. We love us. Ashe.